The vampire king found Arya collapsed in her bathroom, surrounded by empty pill bottles and positive pregnancy tests. 5 attempts to end what shouldn't exist. But his heir's heartbeat thundered through the walls like a war drum, and now every supernatural court in the city would smell the impossible bloodline growing inside her. Arya's bare knees pressed against the cold bathroom tiles as consciousness crept back like a tide pulling away from shore. The metallic taste of blood coated her tongue, and her head throbbed with the kind of pain that felt like her skull might crack open and spill secrets onto the linoleum. 5 empty pill bottles scattered around her like fallen soldiers, their white caps gleaming under the harsh fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered with each of her ragged breaths. The pregnancy tests lined up on the counter edge seemed to pulse with their pink plus signs, each one a tiny beacon of impossibility that made her stomach lurch toward her throat. She had taken the pills religiously, one after another, spacing them exactly as the internet forums had suggested. But her body had rejected every attempt to undo what should never have been done in the first place. The mirror above the sink reflected a stranger with hollow eyes and skin the color of old paper, and for a moment she thought she saw something moving in the shadows behind her reflection, something tall and dark that made her pulse skip like a broken record. When she blinked and looked again, nothing was there except her own terrified face and the faint smell of winter air that had no business being in her locked apartment on a humid Seattle morning. The vampire king stepped through shadow itself like walking through smoke, his form solidifying in the corner of her vision where the mirror couldn't catch him. And Arya's breath stopped entirely as recognition hit her like a physical blow. Kieran Blackthorne moved with the fluid grace of something that had never been entirely human, his silver-streaked dark hair catching the fluorescent light in ways that seemed to bend physics, and his eyes held the pale intensity of winter storms that had raged for centuries without ever finding peace. She remembered fragments now, pieces of a night 3 weeks ago that had felt like stepping through a doorway into someone else's life, a gallery opening where wine had flowed like water, and she had found herself talking to a stranger whose voice seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. He had been wearing a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body, and when he smiled at something she said about the abstract paintings on the walls, she had felt something inside her chest crack open like an egg. They had walked through Pioneer Square in the rain, talking about art and loneliness and the weight of carrying secrets that no one else would understand. And when he had kissed her under a streetlight that flickered like a dying star, every rational thought in her head had simply evaporated. She had never gone home with strangers, never forgotten to be careful, never lost herself so completely in another person's gravity that she forgot her own name until he whispered it against her throat like a prayer. But with him, all her carefully constructed defenses had crumbled like old paper in rain, and she had followed him to a hotel room that seemed to exist outside of time and space, where they had moved together with the desperate intensity of two people trying to crawl inside each other's souls. The memory of his hands on her skin still made her shiver, but now she understood why his touch had felt like electricity, and winter, and coming home all at once. Why his kiss had tasted like copper pennies and starlight. Why she had woken up the next morning with puncture wounds on her throat that had healed impossibly fast and left only the faintest silver scars. Now he stood in her bathroom, like he belonged there, like he had always been part of the shadows that gathered in the corners of her ordinary life. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries and the hollow echo of ancient stone chambers. "Your body cannot reject what chooses to exist," he said, and his words seemed to vibrate through the air between them like struck tuning forks, each syllable carrying implications that made her head spin with vertigo. The morning after pills work on human biology, but vampire essence follows different laws entirely. Laws written before your ancestors learned to make fire or count the phases of the moon. Arya's hands pressed against her still flat stomach, as if she could feel the impossible thing growing inside her, and for a moment she thought she caught the faintest echo of a heartbeat that seemed too strong and too fast and too determined to be denied. "This cannot be happening," she whispered. But even as the words left her lips, she knew they carried no weight against the reality that had already taken root in her body, like a seed planted in soil that had been waiting centuries to bloom. Every supernatural court from Vancouver to San Francisco can sense what grows inside you, Kieran continued, moving closer with steps that made no sound on her bathroom floor, his presence filling the small space like smoke from a fire that burned without heat. The Fey Queen sees abomination where others see prophecy. The werewolf packs smell threat where they should sense balance. And the witch covens whisper of convergence while sharpening knives in the dark. You carry the first vampire-human hybrid in over 500 years, and every faction that has spent centuries maintaining careful borders will want to claim or destroy what you nurture. Arya's ordinary life began to fracture like glass under pressure, as he explained the hidden world that existed in the spaces between coffee shops and tech companies, in the alleys behind Pike Place Market, and the basements of buildings that appeared on no city. Planning documents. Seattle's supernatural community had maintained an uneasy peace for decades, each group claiming territory and influence while hiding from the human population that moved among them like sleepwalkers, never quite seeing the magic that hummed beneath the surface of their everyday reality. But pregnancy changed everything, Kieran said, his winter storm eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel transparent, like he could see through skin and bone to the secret fears she carried in her chest cavity. The child growing inside her would be born at the convergence point of two worlds, carrying blood that could unite the supernatural factions or tear them apart entirely, and every court and pack and coven would want to influence or control what emerged from her body. Protection exists, but it comes with a price, he said, and the word price fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through possibilities she had never imagined. You must stay close to me, in my domain, until the birth, surrounded by wards and guards and ancient protections that can keep you safe from those who would see this pregnancy ended before it can fulfill its purpose. Arya's apartment suddenly felt like a cage made of cardboard and hope, too fragile to protect anything of value, and she understood that accepting his offer meant stepping away from every familiar thing in her life and into a world where the rules she had always counted on no longer applied. But the alternative was facing supernatural predators with nothing but morning-after pills that had already proven useless against the impossible thing taking root in her womb. And when she looked into Kieran's ancient eyes, she saw something that looked almost like hope wrapped in centuries of careful control. The story of his transformation came in fragments like scattered photographs, images of Ireland in 1847, when the potato blight had turned the countryside into a graveyard, and desperate people made bargains with things that lived in the spaces between human understanding and nightmare. He had been Connor then, 26 years old, and watching his village die one family at a time, children with hollow eyes and adults who had given up pretending they believed in tomorrow. The entity had approached him in the ruins of St. Bridget's Chapel, offering power for purpose, immortality for service, the ability to save his people in exchange for becoming something no longer entirely human. The pact had been specific. He could sire one heir, but only when the supernatural world faced convergence, when tensions between factions reached the breaking point where exposure to humanity threatened everything they had built in shadow and secrecy. That time had arrived with her pregnancy, the ancient agreement activating like a clockwork mechanism that had been waiting nearly 2 centuries to fulfill its function. Vampire essence does not follow human reproduction, Kieran explained, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge earned through decades of loneliness and careful observation. When my kind creates new life, it is because that life chooses to exist despite every biological law that should prevent it, because the supernatural world itself calls for change and growth and new possibilities written in blood and starlight. Your pills failed because the child growing inside you decided to live before your body even knew it was pregnant. And nothing in human medicine can argue with a choice made by something that exists half outside the normal flow of time and space. Arya pressed her palms against the bathroom wall to keep herself upright, as understanding crashed over her like cold water. The realization that her body no longer belonged entirely to her, but had become a battlefield where human biology and vampire magic were writing new rules with each heartbeat. The child had chosen existence with the kind of determination that could survive morning after pills and maternal panic and every rational reason why vampire-human hybrids should not be possible in a world that already struggled to contain the supernatural forces that moved beneath its surface. Kieran's cold exterior began to crack as he spoke about centuries of isolation, about watching human civilizations rise and fall while he remained unchanged, about the weight of immortality when it comes without companionship or hope for something beyond endless repetition of the same careful routines. This pregnancy represented both salvation and terror for him. The possibility of creating new life after decades of dealing only in death and preservation, but also the fear that hope itself might be more dangerous than the loneliness he had learned to carry like familiar weight. When he looked at her, Arya saw past the Vampire King's careful control to something that might once have been human, something that remembered what it felt like to want impossible things and believe they might actually come true if you were willing to pay the price, written in blood and time, and all the small deaths that came with choosing love over safety in a world full of beautiful predators. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. The Fae Queen arrived at Kieran's Victorian mansion like winter arriving early, her presence turning the air crystalline and sharp as broken glass, each breath visible in sudden clouds that hung motionless in the parlor where Arya sat wrapped in wool blankets that could not quite chase away the supernatural chill that preceded Luna Silvermoon wherever she walked. She moved through the heavy oak doors without opening them, her form shimmering between states of matter like moonlight on water, and when she finally solidified into something resembling human shape, the very wallpaper seemed to lean away from her otherworldly beauty. Luna's hair fell in waves of liquid silver that caught light from sources that did not exist in the mortal realm, and her eyes held the depthless green of forest pools, where unwary travelers disappeared without leaving ripples on the surface. The Fae Queen wore authority like other beings wore clothing, natural and unquestioned, and when she spoke, her voice carried the sound of wind through ancient trees and the whisper of secrets that should never be shared with mortal tongues. "Balance is the foundation upon which our world rests," she said, settling into the antique armchair across from Arya, with movements that seemed to happen outside normal time, each gesture flowing into the next like choreographed inevitability. For 5 centuries, the supernatural courts have maintained careful equilibrium, each faction claiming territory and influence while ensuring that no single power grows strong enough to dominate the others or expose our existence to the human masses who sleep soundly in their ignorance. Your child threatens that balance catastrophically, growing stronger each day inside your womb while drawing power from bloodlines that should never have been allowed to merge. Luna's fingers traced patterns in the air that left brief trails of luminescence, symbols that hurt to look at directly and seemed to whisper warnings in languages older than written history. "The Fae Court offers you a choice freely given," she continued, her voice taking on the formal cadence of ancient ritual. "Submit to magic that will gently end what should never have begun, allowing your body to return to its natural state while preserving your life and sanity, or bear the harbinger whose birth will shatter treaties written in blood and starfire, whose very existence will invite war between factions that have coexisted peacefully for longer than your mortal civilization has recorded its brief history. The temperature in the room dropped another degree, as Luna's offer hung between them like a sword suspended on spider silk, beautiful and deadly, and requiring only the slightest movement to fall with cutting finality. Arya felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, a maternal instinct that surprised her with its intensity and left no room for rational consideration of consequences or diplomatic solutions to supernatural politics. "No," she said, the word emerging from her throat with more force than she had intended, her hands moving instinctively to cover her stomach, where the impossible child grew stronger with each passing hour. "I will not end this pregnancy for your convenience or anyone else's fear of what my child might become, rather than what she chooses to be when the time comes for choosing." Luna's perfect features shifted into something that might have been surprise, or approval, or predatory interest, emotions flickering across her face like shadows cast by flames, that burned in dimensions beyond human perception. "Very well," the Fey Queen said, rising from her chair with liquid grace that made Arya feel clumsy and earthbound by comparison, "but know that your refusal comes with consequences that will ripple through every supernatural court from here to the Atlantic shore. When the Harbinger is born and the old treaties crumble like autumn leaves, remember that you chose this path despite being offered an alternative that would have preserved the peace our ancestors died to establish." She paused at the threshold between parlor and hallway, her form already beginning to shimmer and fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. But her final words carried across the space with perfect clarity and unmistakable threat. "How curious that you trust the Vampire King so completely when his entire existence has been focused on this moment, this pregnancy, this child who will either crown him emperor of the supernatural world or destroy everything he has spent centuries building in shadow and secrecy. Consider carefully whether your protector seeks to shield you from danger or ensure you remain close enough to serve his purposes until the Harbinger emerges to fulfill whatever destiny he has planned." The Fey Queen vanished like smoke dispersed by wind, leaving only the lingering scent of winter roses and the uncomfortable weight of doubt settling in Arya's chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Kieran appeared in the doorway moments later, his ancient eyes scanning the room for traces of Fey magic and finding the residual energy that clung to furniture and air like invisible frost. But when Arya looked into his face, she saw only concern and careful control, rather than the calculating ambition Luna had suggested lurked beneath his protective exterior. The prenatal appointment took place in a medical office that existed in the basement of a building that appeared to be a vintage bookstore from street level. Dr. Elena Vasquez maintaining her practice in spaces warded against both supernatural detection and human curiosity. Marcus Stormclaw arrived without invitation, his massive frame filling the doorway like a storm front moving across open prairie, the werewolf alpha's presence making every light bulb in the office flicker with the barely contained energy of his wolf nature straining against human form. The confrontation began before greetings could be exchanged, Marcus directing his attention toward Kieran with the kind of focused intensity that preceded either diplomacy or bloodshed, depending on how carefully words were chosen in the next few minutes. "The Cascade Pack has monitored this pregnancy since its impossible beginning," the Alpha said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder and barely leashed power that could tear through flesh and bone without conscious thought. "We will not tolerate a vampire heir that commands werewolf loyalty through hybrid charisma, will not bow to abomination, simply because it carries blood from multiple supernatural lines and calls itself Bridge Builder, while reaching for a crown that has never existed in our carefully balanced world." Dr. Vasquez moved between the two predators with the practiced calm of someone who had mediated supernatural disputes for decades, her hands weaving subtle spells that dampened aggressive instincts and created neutral ground where violence became physically difficult to initiate. The examination itself revealed details that sent shock waves through everyone present, the baby's heartbeat thundering through supernatural frequencies with strength that should not have been possible at barely 8 weeks gestation, its development progressing at a rate that suggested accelerated supernatural growth rather than normal human pregnancy timeline. Most disturbing was the energy flow Dr. Vasquez detected between all three connected beings, the child somehow drawing power from both parents, but affecting them differently as Kieran grew visibly stronger and more vital, while Arya became increasingly fragile and translucent, as if her life force was being slowly drained to fuel something beyond her comprehension or control. The appointment was interrupted when Dr. Vasquez suddenly froze, her enhanced senses detecting watchers outside the building, shadowy figures that moved with purpose and technology rather than supernatural stealth. Humans who knew enough about the hidden world to track its inhabitants, but lacked the magical protections that would hide them from witch sight. "Someone has been monitoring your movements," she whispered, her hands already weaving concealment spells around the office, while Marcus and Kieran moved into defensive positions that spoke of centuries of experience with threats both mortal and supernatural. "We must assume they know about the pregnancy and have plans for you that do not align with your continued freedom or the child's natural development." The revelation of Dr. Vasquez's true role came as the office lights dimmed and candles ignited spontaneously around the examination room, their flames dancing in patterns that had nothing to do with air currents and everything to do with ancient magic preparing to reveal truths that had been hidden behind careful professional facades. "I am not merely a physician who serves the supernatural community," she said, her voice taking on the formal tone of ritual confession, "but a member of the Obsidian Circle, an ancient coven tasked with monitoring and recording supernatural births that might alter the balance between our world and the realm of human existence. Your pregnancy requires documentation not just for medical purposes, but for prophetic evaluation. And I must now perform the reading that will show us what futures spiral out from your child's eventual birth." The candle flames stretched toward the ceiling like reaching fingers as Dr. Vasquez began to chant, in a language that predated written history, her words pulling power from sources that made the air thick and electric with possibility. The vision manifested in the smoke rising from the candles, images forming and dissolving like scenes painted on mist by artists who saw across time rather than space. 3 futures unfolded before their eyes, each one vivid and terrible and beautiful in its own way. The first showed the child as a bridge between worlds, grown into a young woman whose very presence allowed supernatural beings and humans to coexist openly, her hybrid nature serving as proof that different species could create something greater than the sum of their parts, rather than inevitable destruction through incompatibility. Peace reigned in this future, but it was a fragile peace that required constant vigilance and sacrifice from those who remembered the old ways when secrecy had been survival, and exposure meant death for anyone foolish enough to reveal magic to a world that feared what it could not understand or control. The second future painted the child as destroyer, consumed by hungers that could never be satisfied because they demanded both blood and human connection, supernatural power and mortal vulnerability, immortality and the desperate intensity of knowing that everything beautiful must eventually end. This version of the child grew into something that devoured rather than nurtured, using her unique nature to manipulate both supernatural and human populations while growing stronger on the conflicts she created between groups that had once coexisted through careful treaties and mutual respect for boundaries that kept everyone safe from their own worst impulses. The third and most terrible future showed the child's death triggering a supernatural war that exposed everything to humanity, the grief and rage of her parents tearing through treaties and alliances like wildfire through dry timber until the hidden world erupted into open conflict, that could not be contained or explained away as natural disaster or terrorist activity. In this timeline, humans learned about vampires and werewolves and fae through violence and betrayal, through cities burning and governments falling as supernatural factions turned their accumulated power against each other, without regard for the mortal populations caught between opposing forces that cared more about victory than survival of the innocent. But the most shocking revelation came not from the futures, but from the past, as Dr. Vasquez's spell revealed the truth about Arya's own bloodline and the reason she had survived what should have killed her. "You are not entirely human," the witch said, her voice hoarse from channeling power that had left her visibly drained and trembling. "Your mother's line carries dormant witch heritage that activated when you conceived the hybrid child, bloodlines that have been sleeping for generations waiting for the right combination of circumstance and supernatural influence to awaken abilities your ancestors possessed before. Persecution drove them into hiding and intermarriage with purely human families. This explains why you survived the vampire's bite that should have drained you completely, why the baby develops with such supernatural strength, and why you are becoming something more than human. Even as the pregnancy progresses toward whatever destiny awaits your child, and the world that must somehow contain her power, when she finally emerges from the safety of your womb into a reality that may not be ready for what she represents." The awakening bloodlines also explained the protective instincts that had surprised Arya with their intensity, the fierce determination to defend her unborn child against any threat regardless of the source or consequences for supernatural politics that had seemed stable until her pregnancy began rewriting the rules that governed how different species interacted in the hidden spaces beneath human civilization. As the vision faded and the candles guttered out in sudden darkness, everyone present understood that they stood at a crossroads where every choice carried implications that reached far beyond personal preference or individual survival, where the decision to protect or destroy one impossible pregnancy would determine whether the supernatural world remained hidden or emerged into the light of human awareness through cooperation or conquest, through birth or death, through hope or the kind of despair that burned away everything familiar and left only ash where complex societies had once maintained careful balance between competing needs and ancient fears that refused to remain buried in the past where they belonged. Arya's body betrayed her with cravings that made no evolutionary sense, the scent of Kieran's blood calling to something newly awakened in her cellular structure as she sat across from him at breakfast, trying to pretend that orange juice held any appeal, when what she truly wanted was to press her lips to the pulse point at his throat and taste the copper sweetness that flowed beneath his marble-pale skin. The pregnancy had entered its 14th week and brought with it changes that Dr. Vasquez assured her were normal for a supernatural gestation, but felt like wearing someone else's skin that had been tailored to fit too tightly over bones that were shifting into new configurations. Touch had become a minefield of unwanted information, her fingertips picking up emotional residue from every surface she contacted, the coffee mug carrying traces of the barista's morning anxiety, the doorknob humming with accumulated frustration from previous visitors, even Kieran's carefully controlled exterior failing to hide the century of loneliness that clung to him like cologne made from old grief and careful isolation. The glamour magic that concealed the mansion's true nature from human perception flickered and wavered when she looked directly at it, revealing briefly the protective wards carved into window frames and door lintels, the subtle alterations that made the Victorian architecture seem ordinary from the street, while hiding chambers and passages that had never appeared on any city planning documents. Kieran watched her struggle with these developing abilities with the patience of someone who had learned to measure time in decades rather than days, his ancient eyes tracking every shift in her posture and expression as he guided her through exercises designed to build control over powers that wanted to expand and explore without regard for consequences or social appropriateness. The basement training chambers existed 3 levels below street level, carved from bedrock and lined with materials that absorbed supernatural energy while preventing it from seeping into the city's electrical grid or the dreams of sleeping humans in nearby apartments. Here, Kieran moved around her like a dance partner leading someone through steps she had never learned, his hands positioning her arms for channeling exercises, while his voice explained concepts that had no equivalent in human experience or scientific understanding. Feel the energy as it moves through your nervous system, he said, his breath warm against her ear as he adjusted her stance for the 15th time that afternoon, his proximity making her newly sensitive skin tingle with awareness that had nothing to do with the magical lesson and everything to do with the way his presence seemed to fill empty spaces inside her chest cavity. Do not try to control it completely, but guide it like water, finding its path downhill, allowing it to flow where it naturally wants to go while ensuring it does not pool in places where it might cause damage to your human physiology or the child's supernatural development. Their training sessions became an intricate balance of professional instruction and unspoken longing. Kieran's careful touches necessary for proper energy channeling but awakening responses in Arya's changing body that made concentration nearly impossible when he moved behind her to correct her posture, or placed his hands over hers to demonstrate the subtle finger movements that directed power along specific neural pathways. He shared fragments of his transformation during these intimate moments, describing the sensation of dying and being reborn as something that existed between human and monster. The way vampire immortality felt like being trapped in amber while watching the world change around you, in ways that made your original identity feel like a costume that no longer fit properly. 500 years of watching humans live and love and die while I remained unchanged, he confided one evening, as they practiced shielding techniques that required him to stand close enough that she could feel his body heat radiating through the expensive fabric of his shirt. Every connection I attempted ended in loss, because human lifespans are heartbeats compared to vampire existence, and I learned to keep my distance rather than endure the grief that comes with loving something that grows old and fragile while you remain eternally frozen in the moment of your transformation. Arya found herself sharing fears she had never voiced to another living soul, the terror of becoming something monstrous that craved blood and violence, the worry that her child would inherit the worst aspects of both species rather than their potential for bridging the gap between human and supernatural existence. "What if I lose myself completely?" she whispered during a particularly difficult session when the blood cravings had become so intense that she could barely focus on anything except the rhythm of his pulse and the imagined taste of copper pennies and starlight. What if I become something that can only survive by harming others? Something that my child will fear rather than love when she finally emerges into a world that already contains too many predators and not enough protectors. The sexual tension that built between them during these forced proximities became another kind of energy that required careful channeling, their bodies responding to touch and shared vulnerability with an intensity that surprised them both and made the basement chambers feel electric with possibility and restraint. Kieran's hands would linger against her skin when adjusting her position for energy work, and Arya found herself leaning into his touch with a desperation that had nothing to do with magical instruction and everything to do with the growing awareness that he understood her transformation in ways no one else could comprehend. Yet both of them pulled back from the edge of acting on these feelings, the complicated circumstances of her pregnancy and their supernatural natures creating a minefield where passion and practicality warred with consequences too dangerous to ignore. The Fey assassins struck during their most vulnerable moment, when Arya's shields were down for advanced energy channeling and Kieran was positioned behind her, with his hands on her shoulders. Both of them so focused on the delicate work of expanding her magical capacity that they missed the subtle wrongness that preceded supernatural attack. They materialized through shadow magic that bypassed the mansion's wards by riding along ley lines that connected the building to the broader supernatural infrastructure of the Pacific Northwest, their forms solidifying from smoke and starlight, with weapons that gleamed like captured moonbeams and sang with harmonics that hurt human ears. The first attacker moved toward Arya with inhuman speed, her blade aimed at the subtle swell of pregnancy that housed the hybrid child Luna Silvermoon had declared an abomination requiring immediate termination. But something in Arya's newly awakened bloodlines recognized the threat with an intensity that bypassed conscious thought and triggered responses that had been dormant for generations of careful hiding and intermarriage with purely human families, the Khan. Protective instinct manifested as raw energy that erupted from her skin like lightning-seeking ground, pure destructive force that caught the lead assassin in mid-strike and reduced her to ash and memory before she could complete her killing blow. The second attacker hesitated just long enough for Arya's power to surge again, this time with more control and devastating precision, the Fey warrior simply ceasing to exist, as magical energy rewrote the fundamental particles of his existence and scattered them across dimensional barriers that kept the mortal realm separate from courts, where time moved differently and death held less permanent meaning. Kieran stared at the empty spaces where the assassins had been standing moments before, his ancient eyes wide with something that looked like awe mixed with carefully controlled fear as he realized that Arya's developing abilities far exceeded anything he had anticipated or prepared to handle. "You are more powerful than I imagined possible," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in his centuries of experience with supernatural phenomena. "The question now is whether that power will remain under your control or begin to control you as the pregnancy progresses, and the child's influence over your transformation becomes stronger with each passing day." The attack revealed vulnerabilities in their security that went beyond simple magical protection, evidence pointing toward betrayal from someone with intimate knowledge of their routines and the mansion's defensive systems. Dr. Vasquez's access to their medical information made her an obvious suspect, but the timing and precision of the assault suggested multiple sources of intelligence gathering that included surveillance of their training schedules and detailed knowledge of when Arya would be most vulnerable to supernatural attack. Suspicion fractured their small circle of allies, each member becoming a potential threat whose loyalties required constant evaluation and testing through methods that felt like violations of trust but seemed necessary for survival in a world where betrayal could arrive wearing familiar faces and speaking words of friendship while planning destruction. The aftermath of the attack created an intimacy between Kieran and Arya that years of normal courtship could not have achieved, shared danger stripping away pretense and revealing the raw truth of their connection beneath all the supernatural complications that made their relationship feel like navigating a minefield blindfolded. When he finally kissed her in the ruins of the training chamber, surrounded by scorch marks and the lingering energy of violent death, it felt like coming home to a place she had never known existed until his lips touched hers, with centuries of loneliness and newfound hope. Their first intimate encounter began with desperate urgency born from adrenaline and proximity to mortality. Hands, seeking skin and confirmation that they had both survived the attack intact and capable of creating something beautiful in the face of forces that wanted to destroy what they were building together. But their passion was interrupted by the child's response, her heartbeat suddenly synchronizing with both parents, in a rhythm that seemed to echo through dimensions beyond normal space-time, creating a psychic bond that allowed thoughts and emotions to flow between all three connected beings with an intensity that was both wonderful and terrifying. Through this unexpected connection, Arya felt the truth of Kieran's feelings. The genuine surprise he had experienced when learning about her pregnancy. The centuries of preparation that had focused on duty and prophecy, rather than love and partnership. He had not planned or manipulated her conception, but had been as caught off guard as she, when the ancient entity began fulfilling the pact that had been dormant since his transformation in 1847, when supernatural tensions reached the breaking point that triggered automatic responses written into magic older than recorded civilization. The psychic bond revealed layers of emotion that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge openly, love growing alongside fear and hope, intertwining with desperate determination to protect what they were creating, despite opposition from every supernatural faction that viewed change as threat rather than opportunity for growth and evolution. But the connection also made them vulnerable to each other's pain, in ways that added complexity to every interaction. Shared sensation, meaning that Arya's morning sickness became Kieran's nausea. His memories of centuries-old grief flowing through her dreams until she woke up crying for losses that belonged to someone else's history. Their love affair had to navigate not just the normal challenges of new relationships, but the additional burden of supernatural politics and psychic intimacy that left no room for small deceptions or careful emotional distance, every feeling and fear and moment of doubt flowing between them with the ruthless honesty that comes when minds touch without barriers or protective walls. As her abilities continued to develop and the child grew stronger in her womb, Arya understood that her transformation was only beginning, that whatever emerged from this pregnancy would be something entirely new in supernatural history rather than simply vampire or human or witch, but a hybrid that carried the potential to rewrite the rules that had governed species interaction for millennia. The question remaining was whether that rewriting would come through creation or destruction, through love or violence, through the kind of hope that built bridges between worlds, or the kind of fear that burned them down and left only ash where complex civilizations had once found ways to coexist, despite fundamental differences in nature and need. The betrayal cut deeper than physical wounds because it came wrapped in familiar kindness and professional concern. Dr. Vasquez's confessions spilling through tears that carved tracks down her cheeks, while her hands shook with the weight of secrets she had carried for months, like poisoned gifts too dangerous to unwrap. Elena had been feeding information to the Reformation since before Arya's first appointment, her reports detailing every aspect of the hybrid pregnancy from fetal development rates to the mother's awakening magical abilities. But the coercion had begun years earlier when black sedans appeared outside her sister Maria's house in Portland, and men in expensive suits made it clear that cooperation was not optional when national security hung in the balance. "They have Isabella and Miguel," Elena whispered, her voice breaking on the names of children who had never asked to become leverage in supernatural politics, 8 and 10 years old, and hidden in facilities where their aunt's compliance ensures their safety, while their disappearance from normal life has been explained away through carefully forged documents that show tragic accidents requiring extended hospitalization in private institutions. The Reformation had been tracking supernatural populations for decades, Elena revealed, their organization growing from a small government task force into something that combined military resources with cutting-edge scientific research and the kind of funding that suggested connections reaching into the highest levels of federal authority. They view the supernatural community as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be exploited, and your child represents the breakthrough they have been waiting for since they first learned that vampires and werewolves and witches exist in the shadows of human civilization. Dr. James Morrison had been particularly interested in the biological mechanisms that allowed vampire-human reproduction, Elena continued, her medical training making her explanation clinical even while her emotional state remained fractured by guilt and fear for her captured family members. The Reformation's ultimate goal was creating artificial supernatural soldiers, humans enhanced with abilities that had previously required centuries of evolution or magical transformation. And a hybrid child's blood contained the genetic keys that could unlock those possibilities through synthetic serums, rather than the dangerous process of actual supernatural conversion. Kieran's rage manifested as temperature drops that made windows frost over, despite the summer heat outside, his centuries of careful control cracking under the weight of understanding how thoroughly they had been monitored and manipulated by enemies who possessed both technological advantages and complete disregard for supernatural sovereignty. The psychic bond between him and Arya carried his fury across whatever distance separated them, the connection crackling with energy that made Elena step backward and wrap protective shields around herself out of instinctive self-preservation as ancient vampire power filled the room like electricity before a storm. But beneath the anger lay something deeper and more dangerous. The realization that human knowledge of supernatural existence had progressed far beyond what any faction had suspected, and that the careful balance maintained through secrecy had been compromised by adversaries who planned conquest rather than coexistence. The kidnapping happened during what should have been routine medical monitoring, Elena's hands trembling as she prepared equipment, while knowing that each test provided more data for handlers who viewed Arya not as a patient, but as an incubator carrying experimental material too valuable to remain in uncontrolled circumstances. The sedative injection came disguised as a vitamin supplement necessary for hybrid fetal development. Elena's training allowing her to deliver the dose while maintaining professional calm, even as her conscience screamed protests that she swallowed behind careful medical explanations about the importance of maternal nutrition during supernatural pregnancy. Arya felt consciousness sliding away like water through cupped hands, her awareness dimming despite every instinct demanding that she fight whatever was happening to her body, and the child who depended on her protection from threats she was only beginning to understand. The underground facility existed in spaces that had been carved from bedrock beneath a research complex that appeared on official records as a private medical corporation specializing in genetic therapies for rare diseases. Its true purpose hidden behind layers of corporate structure and government classification that made investigation nearly impossible for anyone lacking the appropriate security clearances. Dr. James Morrison moved through these sterile corridors with the confidence of someone who had spent years building something he believed would change the fundamental balance of power between human and supernatural populations, his vision extending beyond simple military applications to encompass a future where enhanced humans could claim dominance over species that had hidden their abilities for centuries. When Arya regained consciousness in a medical suite that combined hospital functionality with prison security, Morrison's explanations came with the casual enthusiasm of a researcher describing breakthrough discoveries to colleagues who shared his excitement about possibilities that previous generations could never have imagined. Your child represents the culmination of decades of theoretical work, he said, reviewing charts that tracked her vital signs and fetal development with the detached interest of someone studying laboratory specimens, rather than living beings deserving of basic dignity and respect. The hybrid nature creates unique cellular structures that bridge human and vampire physiologies in ways that can be replicated artificially once we understand the precise mechanisms involved, allowing us to grant supernatural abilities to human subjects without the traditional requirements of transformation or magical inheritance. Morrison's vision for the future included armies of enhanced soldiers who could match vampire speed and strength while retaining human intelligence and adaptability, agents who could infiltrate supernatural communities with abilities that would make them indistinguishable from natural-born magical beings until the moment they revealed their true allegiance to human interests over species loyalty. The pregnancy would be allowed to continue under controlled conditions, he explained, but the child's life would unfold in captivity, where every aspect of her development could be monitored and studied, while her unique biology provided ongoing source material for serum production and enhancement research that required regular blood samples and tissue analysis. The threat to her unborn daughter triggered responses in Arya that bypassed conscious thought and drew directly on witch bloodlines that had been awakening since conception began altering her cellular structure in ways that defied conventional understanding of magical inheritance patterns. Power erupted from her nervous system, with the force of generations of suppressed ability finally finding expression through desperation and protective instinct that recognized no limitations imposed by scientific equipment or security measures designed to contain normal human prisoners. The psychic distress call that shot through her bond with Kieran carried not just information about her location and circumstances, but raw emotional data that painted vivid pictures of her terror and determination to protect their child, regardless of personal cost or the consequences such protection might have for supernatural secrecy that had already been compromised beyond any hope of simple damage control. Kieran received her message like a physical blow that doubled him over with shared pain and fury, the psychic connection allowing him to experience her fear as if it were his own, while simultaneously providing detailed sensory information about her surroundings that could be used to locate the facility where she was being held against her will, by enemies who viewed supernatural beings as either threats to eliminate or resources to exploit for human advancement. The alliance between traditional enemies formed out of necessity rather than trust, Luna Silvermoon and Marcus Stormclaw, setting aside centuries of careful territorial boundaries to join forces with Kieran against adversaries who threatened not just individual supernatural beings, but the entire hidden world that had developed over millennia of coexistence through careful balance and mutual respect for species differences. Luna's fey magic could penetrate technological security systems that relied on electromagnetic barriers rather than supernatural protections. Her ability to move between dimensions, allowing infiltration through spaces that existed parallel to normal reality, while Marcus brought werewolf pack coordination and physical capabilities that complemented vampire speed and magical resources in ways that created tactical advantages no single faction could achieve independently. The rescue mission required careful planning that balanced supernatural abilities against human technology, while accounting for the possibility that Arya's condition might deteriorate under stress in ways that could endanger both mother and child if the operation extended longer than her pregnant body could handle. Each faction contributed specialized knowledge and capabilities, Luna providing intelligence about the facility's dimensional weak points, where Fey magic could create temporary portals, Marcus coordinating pack movements that would distract security forces while the primary rescue team approached from unexpected angles, and Kieran, using vampire infiltration techniques, refined over centuries of moving through human settlements without detection or lasting trace of supernatural involvement. But the stress of captivity and the psychic energy required to maintain her connection with Kieran, while fighting off Morrison's attempts at medical examination, triggered premature labor that began just as the rescue team penetrated the facility's outer defenses. Arya's contractions, starting with supernatural intensity, that suggested the child was responding to her mother's desperate need to escape, before more invasive procedures could be implemented by researchers who viewed her pregnancy as an experiment rather than the creation of new life that deserved protection from those who would exploit her unique nature. The timing created a crisis within a crisis, forcing the rescue team to fight through enhanced security responses while protecting both mother and child during a supernatural birth that was beginning weeks ahead of schedule, in circumstances that offered none of the medical support or magical assistance that such an unprecedented delivery required for successful completion. Contractions racked Arya's body with force that seemed to channel all her accumulated magical energy into the physical process of bringing her daughter into a world that was already trying to claim ownership of her before she had drawn her first independent breath. Each surge of pain accompanied by power fluctuations that interfered with facility electronics and created opportunities for the rescue team to advance through corridors where human technology had been designed to contain supernatural prisoners, but not to withstand the kind of raw magical energy that accompanied hybrid birth under extreme stress. The rescue became a race against time as labor progressed with supernatural speed, while Morrison's security forces mobilized resources that included weapons specifically designed to incapacitate vampire and werewolf physiology, forcing the allied supernatural factions to protect Arya during her most vulnerable moments, while fighting enemies who had prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation through years of studying supernatural abilities and developing countermeasures that leveled playing fields, where enhanced humans could match creatures who had previously enjoyed overwhelming advantages in direct combat situations. The birth began as screams echoed through sterile corridors, where supernatural battles raged like storms contained within concrete walls, Arya's body surrendering to forces older than human medicine, while explosions shook the underground facility and emergency lighting cast everything in blood-red shadows that seemed appropriate for the emergence of something unprecedented in the history of vampire-human relations. Each contraction felt like lightning channeled through her nervous system, the child demanding entry into a world that was simultaneously trying to claim her and destroy her before she could draw breath, independent of her mother's supernatural enhanced physiology. Kieran fought through security forces armed with weapons designed specifically to neutralize vampire speed and strength, his centuries of combat experience adapting to technological countermeasures, while Luna's fey magic created dimensional rifts that allowed the rescue team to appear behind enemy lines, where Morrison's enhanced soldiers had not expected supernatural assault to manifest through folded space rather than direct confrontation. Marcus coordinated werewolf pack attacks that created chaos and confusion among human defenders who had studied supernatural abilities in laboratory conditions, but had never faced the reality of coordinated lycanthrope fury unleashed in confined spaces where their enhanced senses and pack coordination created overwhelming tactical advantages that no amount of technological preparation could completely neutralize. But it was the child herself who ended the battle, her emergence into existence triggering a supernatural shockwave that rippled outward from the medical suite like a stone dropped into still water. Electromagnetic pulses disabling every piece of electronic equipment in the facility, while simultaneously carrying visions across 50 miles of Pacific Northwest territory to every supernatural being capable of receiving psychic impressions. The baby girl came into the world with silver eyes that shifted to blue, like storm clouds moving across winter sky, her pale skin carrying a luminescence that had nothing to do with normal human biology and everything to do with power that bridged multiple supernatural bloodlines in ways that had never been successfully combined in previous attempts at cross-species reproduction. "Isabella," Arya whispered, the name emerging from somewhere deeper than conscious choice, somewhere that connected to ancestral memories and prophetic dreams that had been building toward this moment since Kieran first made his bargain with entities that existed between dimensions and measured time in geological rather than human scales. The newborn's awareness unsettled everyone present, her eyes tracking movement and focusing on faces with intensity that suggested consciousness far beyond what should have been possible for someone who had been breathing independently for less than an hour. She seemed to recognize Kieran immediately, reaching toward him with tiny fingers that glowed faintly in the darkness, while the psychic bond that had connected her parents during pregnancy expanded to include her with an intensity that left all three of them reeling from shared sensations and emotions that flowed between them without regard for individual boundaries or personal privacy. The visions triggered by her birth rippled through supernatural consciousness like revelation and nightmare combined, each being who received them, seeing different potential futures depending on their own nature and fears and hopes for what this hybrid child might become when her powers fully manifested. Some saw salvation in her existence, a bridge between worlds that could end centuries of hiding and allow supernatural beings to emerge from shadow into cooperation with humanity, while others saw destruction in her potential to rewrite fundamental laws that had kept different species separate and stable through careful balance maintained across millennia of coexistence. The Fae courts received visions of reality itself, becoming fluid as Isabella matured, the rigid boundaries between mortal and magical realms dissolving under her influence, until chaos replaced the order that had allowed both worlds to function according to their own internal logic. Werewolf packs saw her either as the ultimate alpha who could unite all lycanthropes under single leadership, or as an abomination whose mixed nature would contaminate the purity that came from connection to lunar cycles and pack bonds forged in blood and transformation. Vampire covens glimpsed futures where she either elevated their entire species to new levels of power and influence, or destroyed the careful predator-prey balance that had allowed them to feed without exposing themselves to human retaliation through systematic hunting and extermination campaigns. The ancient entity manifested during Isabella's first feeding, reality bending around its presence like light, refracting through prisms made from crystallized time and impossibility, its form shifting between dimensions in ways that made direct observation difficult and left afterimages burned into the retinas of anyone foolish enough to stare directly at something that existed partially outside normal spacetime. It had been waiting for this moment since Kieran's transformation in 1847, the pact that bound them finally reaching fruition through circumstances that had required nearly 2 centuries of careful manipulation and preparation to align properly. Isabella is not merely vampire-human hybrid. The entity communicated through thoughts that bypassed language and spoke directly to consciousness itself, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in bone marrow and neural tissue with frequencies that predated human evolution. She represents convergence between mortal and supernatural realms, a bridge capable of rewriting fundamental laws that have kept your species separated since the first supernatural beings chose hiding over open coexistence with humanity. Her bloodlines were chosen specifically for this purpose, Kieran's ancient vampire power providing the supernatural foundation, while Arya's awakened witch heritage contributed the flexibility necessary for conscious choice about her ultimate nature, rather than being bound by the limitations that typically define vampire or human or magical existence. The entity revealed the full scope of its planning, centuries of subtle influence that had guided events toward this singular birth, where all necessary elements could combine in ways that created unprecedented possibilities for supernatural evolution and integration with human civilization. Isabella possessed capabilities that transcended traditional categories, her hybrid nature allowing her to choose her path rather than being constrained by the biological and magical limitations that defined pure-blood supernatural beings, who were bound by their transformation circumstances and species-specific requirements for survival and reproduction. She could embrace fully human existence, rejecting the supernatural elements of her heritage in favor of normal mortal life that would allow her to age and die like her mother's ancestors. Or she could choose complete vampire transformation that would grant immortality and enhanced abilities while accepting the hunger and isolation that came with predatory nature. But the third option represented something entirely new in supernatural history, the possibility of conscious integration between mortal and magical elements that could create hybrid existence without the traditional weaknesses or limitations that plagued previous attempts at cross-species development. As Isabella took her first feeding, requiring both breast milk and small amounts of blood that Kieran provided through careful cuts on his wrist that healed immediately after she had taken what her developing physiology demanded, it became clear that her nature was fundamentally different from anything that had existed before in the documented history of vampire-human relations. She did not weaken Arya during feeding, but somehow strengthened her mother, the psychic bond allowing energy to flow in both directions, so that nourishing the child also revitalized the woman who had carried her through pregnancy that had defied every medical and magical precedent for successful supernatural gestation. The supernatural factions gathered at Kieran's mansion within days of Isabella's birth, representatives from courts and pacts and covens that had maintained careful neutrality for decades, suddenly finding themselves united by the need to address what this unprecedented child might mean for the future of their hidden world. Luna Silvermoon arrived with the formal authority of the Fae courts, her arguments emphasizing the importance of neutrality in Isabella's upbringing to prevent any single faction from gaining influence over someone whose adult capabilities could potentially reshape supernatural politics across multiple continents. Marcus Stormclaw spoke for werewolf interests, advocating for pack-based education that would teach Isabella the importance of loyalty and community bonds that had allowed lycanthrope society to maintain stability through centuries of persecution and forced adaptation to human expansion into traditional territorial boundaries. The vampire delegation, led by ancient bloodlines that predated Kieran's own transformation, argued for embracing the predatory heritage that could make Isabella the most powerful supernatural being in recorded history, capable of commanding other vampires while possessing abilities that pure-blood vampires could never hope to achieve through traditional enhancement or magical augmentation. Witch representatives from covens across the Pacific Northwest presented their case for magical education that would allow Isabella to understand and control the power she had inherited through her mother's awakened bloodlines, arguing that without proper training in ancient wisdoms and traditional spellcraft, her abilities could become dangerous to herself and everyone around her as they continued to develop during childhood and adolescence. Each faction brought gifts and threats in equal measure, offerings of knowledge and protection balanced against warnings about what would happen if their specific guidance was rejected in favor of influences they considered harmful or inadequate for raising someone whose adult decisions would affect every supernatural community from Alaska to Mexico. The council meeting stretched through the night as representatives debated possibilities and presented evidence for their particular approaches to Isabella's future education and development. But the child herself remained the ultimate unknown factor in equations that attempted to predict outcomes based on precedents that had never included someone with her unique combination of bloodlines and abilities. She slept peacefully in Arya's arms throughout the discussions, occasionally opening silver blue eyes that seemed to track conversations with intelligence that suggested understanding beyond her biological age, but offering no indication of which path she might choose when the time came for conscious decision about her supernatural nature and role in the hidden world that had been forever changed by her existence. The ancient entity's revelation hung over every debate like storm clouds gathering before inevitable weather, the knowledge that Isabella possessed free will, regarding her ultimate nature adding complexity to every argument about her upbringing and education. No faction could claim certainty about how their influence might affect someone who could choose to reject supernatural existence entirely or embrace possibilities that transcended traditional categories of vampire or witch or fae or werewolf allegiance. The unprecedented nature of her birth had rewritten assumptions about supernatural reproduction and development, creating scenarios where previous rules no longer applied, and new precedents would need to be established through careful observation of how hybrid physiology and psychology developed under various environmental and social conditions that had never been tested with someone possessing her unique combination of heritage and potential for conscious choice about species identity. The Reformation's assault began at dawn, with coordinated strikes across Seattle's supernatural territories. Morrison's enhanced soldiers moving through the city with weapons that hummed with electromagnetic frequencies specifically calibrated to disrupt vampire healing, werewolf transformation, and Fey dimensional manipulation, while targeting the neural pathways that allowed supernatural beings to access abilities that had evolved over centuries of adaptation to magical energy fields. Each faction found their safe houses and gathering places under simultaneous attack, the precision suggesting years of surveillance and intelligence gathering that had mapped every supernatural presence in the Pacific Northwest with the thoroughness of military planners preparing for total war rather than simple containment or negotiation. Pike Place Market became a killing ground where enhanced soldiers used acoustic weapons that targeted werewolf hearing while deploying silver-laced ammunition and UV projectors that could incapacitate vampires even in broad daylight, their tactics revealing intimate knowledge of supernatural weaknesses that could only have come from extensive experimentation on captured subjects who had provided involuntary data about species-specific vulnerabilities. The Fae courts found their dimensional portals blocked by technology that created electromagnetic barriers in spaces between worlds, trapping Luna's people in normal reality, where they were vulnerable to weapons designed around their inability to fully manifest in the mortal realm, without access to their home dimensions that existed parallel to human spacetime. Dr. Vasquez's intelligence had been more comprehensive than anyone realized. Her reports including detailed physiological data about each faction's combat capabilities and regenerative limitations, behavioral patterns that could be exploited through psychological warfare, and tactical weaknesses that had never been tested against coordinated human resistance backed by advanced technology and unlimited government funding. The supernatural factions faced extinction not through individual defeat, but through systematic elimination of their ability to maintain the hidden existence that had protected them for millennia. Morrison's plan designed to force them into open conflict where superior human numbers and preparation would overwhelm magical advantages that had previously made supernatural beings effectively invincible against mortal threats. But Isabella's presence changed calculations that Morrison had spent years perfecting, the infant's unconscious response to danger manifesting as protective fields that neutralized anti-supernatural weapons within an expanding radius, around wherever Arya carried her during the chaos of urban warfare that transformed Seattle's streets into battlegrounds where ancient magic clashed with cutting-edge technology. The child's silver-blue eyes tracked aircraft overhead and enhanced soldiers moving through buildings with awareness that suggested tactical understanding beyond her biological age, her tiny hands glowing with energy that disrupted targeting systems and communication equipment whenever Reformation forces attempted to coordinate attacks against her family or the supernatural beings who had gathered to protect her from capture or elimination. Kieran moved through combat zones with renewed strength that seemed to flow directly from his bond with Isabella, his vampire abilities enhanced by connection to someone whose hybrid nature amplified supernatural power, while simultaneously making it more efficient and precise than anything achieved through traditional vampire enhancement techniques. Marcus's werewolf pack found their transformation abilities protected by Isabella's unconscious shielding, allowing them to change forms despite acoustic weapons that should have disrupted the neurological processes that governed lycanthrope shapeshifting during combat situations where human and wolf capabilities needed to blend seamlessly for maximum tactical effectiveness. Luna discovered that her Fey magic could function normally within Isabella's protective radius, dimensional portals opening despite electromagnetic interference that had previously blocked access to realms where her people drew power from sources that existed outside normal spacetime and physical laws that governed mortal reality. The realization that Isabella was actively protecting the supernatural community triggered debate among faction leaders who had spent days arguing about her future education, while Morrison's forces prepared systematic elimination of everyone she was unconsciously shielding from weapons designed to exploit their species-specific vulnerabilities through decades of research and experimentation on captured supernatural subjects. During the height of battle, as Reformation forces concentrated their assault on the mansion where Isabella remained under protection of multiple supernatural guards, Arya felt awakening power that reached beyond her recently activated witch heritage into bloodlines that connected her to ancient magic users who had once served as bridges between human and supernatural communities before persecution drove them into hiding and intermarriage that diluted their abilities across generations of careful concealment. The power that flowed through her nervous system carried memories of ancestors who had possessed capabilities that transcended simple spellcasting or potion brewing. Women who could temporarily grant supernatural abilities to willing human recipients and enhance existing magical powers through direct energy transfer that required physical contact and emotional connection between giver and receiver. These bridge witches had been eliminated centuries ago by both human authorities who feared their influence and supernatural factions who viewed their ability to enhance mortals as threat to the careful separation that kept different species distinct and manageable according to traditional power structures that depended on clear boundaries between enhanced and normal beings. Arya's bloodline carried dormant potential that had been awakened by vampire pregnancy and intensified through psychic bonding with Kieran and Isabella. The unique circumstances of hybrid gestation, creating conditions where suppressed genetic expressions could manifest with power that exceeded anything achieved by her ancestors, who had worked within magical limitations imposed by their purely human physiology and social restrictions that prevented full exploration of their enhancement capabilities. But accessing her complete potential required accepting transformation that would fundamentally alter her human nature, burning away mortal limitations while establishing permanent connection to supernatural energy sources that would grant immortality at the cost of everything that had previously defined her identity as normal person living ordinary life in world where magic remained hidden from general population. The choice presented itself during assault on Pike Place Market, where Morrison's forces had established command center for public ceremony designed to use Isabella's blood in demonstration that would prove supernatural existence to human population, while justifying Reformation authority over beings whose hidden nature had previously protected them from systematic persecution and control. The ceremony location had been chosen for maximum symbolic impact, the tourist attraction providing stage where revelation of vampire and werewolf existence would reach global media coverage that could not be suppressed or explained away as hoax or terrorist incident that government authorities could contain through conventional information management techniques. Morrison's plan required capturing Isabella alive, but was prepared to use her death as equally effective propaganda tool, her hybrid nature providing evidence that supernatural beings had been secretly breeding with humans while hiding among normal population that had unknowingly supported predators through taxes and social systems that protected criminals who fed on citizens too ignorant to recognize threats living next door. Arya understood that preventing this exposure required power beyond anything she had previously accessed, abilities that would allow her to enhance every supernatural being present, while temporarily granting combat capabilities to human allies who volunteered to receive magical augmentation that could level playing fields where Reformation technology had created overwhelming advantages for enhanced soldiers operating with government support and unlimited resources. The transformation began as she accepted permanent change that would preserve her consciousness and memories, while rewriting cellular structure according to patterns established by ancestors whose bridge witch abilities had been suppressed for centuries but never completely eliminated from genetic expression that waited for proper circumstances to activate dormant potential. Power flowed through her nervous system like electricity seeking ground, each surge carrying information about enhancement techniques that had been perfected by generations of women who had served as conduits between human and supernatural populations before political pressures made their existence too dangerous for either community to tolerate. Her connection with Kieran deepened beyond emotional bonding into shared consciousness that allowed perfect coordination during combat situations, where split-second timing meant difference between victory and elimination of everyone they had sworn to protect from enemies who viewed supernatural existence as either threat requiring elimination or resource requiring control for human advancement through artificial enhancement programs. Their partnership transcended normal romantic relationships, becoming tactical fusion, where vampire speed and enhanced witch abilities combined into something greater than sum of individual capabilities. Anticipation replacing communication as they moved through battles with synchronization that made them appear to be single organism with multiple forms, rather than separate beings cooperating against common enemies. Arya's enhancement abilities allowed her to temporarily grant supernatural speed to Marcus's werewolf pack, increase Luna's dimensional manipulation range, and strengthen Kieran's vampire powers beyond anything he had achieved during centuries of existence. But each use of her bridge witch capabilities burned away another layer of human limitation, until she existed in state between mortal and supernatural that could not be reversed through any magic or medical intervention currently known to exist. The final battle raged through Pike Place Market as supernatural forces enhanced by Arya's power confronted Reformation soldiers whose advanced weapons proved inadequate against abilities that had been amplified beyond the parameters Morrison's research had anticipated, his advantage in technology neutralized by magic that operated according to principles his scientific training could not comprehend or counter through conventional tactical approaches. Isabella's protective fields expanded under stress of proximity to large-scale combat, her unconscious response to danger, creating zones where anti-supernatural weapons simply ceased to function, while allowing enhanced supernatural beings to operate at full capacity against enemies who had depended on technological superiority to overcome magical advantages that pure-blood supernatural beings possessed through evolutionary development and species-specific adaptations. The Reformation's defeat came with the sound of Morrison's command center collapsing as Isabella's protective energy overloaded every piece of electronic equipment in Pike Place Market, sparks cascading from surveillance cameras and communication devices, while enhanced soldiers found their weapons reduced to expensive paperweights that could no longer target supernatural beings who moved through the marketplace like forces of nature reclaiming territory that had been temporarily occupied by enemies who had underestimated the power of unity forged in desperate circumstances. Morrison himself stood among the wreckage of his plans, watching decades of research and preparation crumble as supernatural factions that had spent centuries maintaining careful separation worked together with coordination that his intelligence gathering had never predicted or prepared countermeasures to address through technological advantages that proved inadequate against magic amplified beyond the parameters his scientific models had established as theoretical maximums for supernatural enhancement. Arya felt the transformation completing itself as her bridge witch abilities burned away the last vestiges of purely human limitation, her cellular structure rewriting itself according to patterns that connected her to ancestors who had possessed similar capabilities but had never been forced to access their complete potential through circumstances that required choosing between personal identity and survival of everyone she loved, including the impossible daughter whose existence had triggered conflicts that reshaped supernatural politics across multiple continents. The change left her immortal, but fundamentally altered, existing in state between human and supernatural, that granted abilities her ancestors had only dreamed of achieving, while preserving memories and emotional connections that defined her essential self despite physiological modifications that made return to normal life impossible through any known magical or medical intervention. Dr. Vasquez emerged from custody as Reformation Authority collapsed, her liberation allowing her to reveal the full extent of coercion that had forced her cooperation with enemies who had threatened her family, while demanding intelligence about supernatural physiology that enabled development of weapons specifically designed to exploit species-specific vulnerabilities through decades of experimentation on captured beings who had provided involuntary data about magical energy manipulation and regenerative limitations. Elena's medical expertise became invaluable for establishing new protocols that could address supernatural healthcare needs without exposing patients to human authorities who lacked understanding of vampire healing rates, werewolf transformation stress, or fey-dimensional displacement injuries that required treatment modalities unknown to conventional medicine, practiced in facilities designed around purely human physiology and standard pharmaceutical interventions. The victory revealed implications that extended far beyond Seattle's supernatural community. Isabella's birth, having somehow altered fundamental barriers that had previously prevented safe bridging between human and supernatural existence, through conscious choice, rather than accidental transformation or magical inheritance that bound individuals to specific species characteristics without option for modification or voluntary enhancement through bridge-witch intervention. Other couples began discovering pregnancies that defied biological possibility. Human women carrying vampire or werewolf or fey children with hybrid potential that suggested Isabella's existence had opened pathways for supernatural reproduction that had been blocked for centuries by magical barriers that protected species purity while preventing dangerous experimentation with crossbreeding that could have produced unstable offspring lacking viability in either human or supernatural environments. The new possibilities required careful management to prevent chaos that could expose supernatural existence to human populations unprepared for revelation, that magic existed alongside technology in parallel civilizations that had developed different solutions to fundamental questions about survival, society, and the relationship between individual power and community responsibility that defined successful long-term coexistence between beings with vastly different capabilities and needs. 6 months after Isabella's birth, Seattle had become testing ground for supernatural human cooperation that remained hidden from broader world awareness, while establishing precedents for integration that could be implemented in other cities when circumstances allowed expansion of programs that demonstrated successful coexistence through understanding rather than domination or elimination of differences that had previously been viewed as insurmountable obstacles to peaceful interaction between species with fundamentally different natures. Kieran discovered that centuries of careful isolation had been preparation for partnership rather than eternal solitude. His vampire nature adapting to genuine love and shared responsibility in ways that challenged assumptions about immortal beings' capacity for emotional growth and psychological development beyond survival. Instincts and predatory behaviors that had defined vampire existence since the earliest recorded transformations created beings who existed primarily through consumption and control rather than creation and cooperation. His relationship with Arya required learning to balance supernatural power with vulnerability that came from caring about someone whose immortality was newly acquired and whose transformation into bridge witch capabilities meant accepting changes in their dynamic that required constant negotiation and mutual adaptation, rather than relying on established patterns of vampire dominance that had characterized his previous interactions with beings he considered less powerful or sophisticated than himself. Arya's role as liaison between communities demanded skills that transcended her background in marketing coordination, requiring diplomatic abilities that could navigate supernatural politics while maintaining human perspective that allowed her to serve as translator between groups whose fundamental assumptions about reality, ethics, and social organization had developed along completely different lines over centuries of separate evolution and careful avoidance of meaningful contact that might have led to conflict or unwanted influence between species that had learned to coexist through distance rather than integration. Her immortality came with responsibilities that extended beyond personal relationships to include guidance for other women discovering impossible pregnancies, helping them understand transformation options while respecting their autonomy to choose paths that might include rejecting supernatural enhancement in favor of normal human existence, or embracing abilities that would fundamentally alter their identity and social connections in ways that could never be reversed through any currently available intervention. Isabella's development continued at supernatural pace, but retained innocence that manifested through instinctive use of protective and healing abilities, rather than destructive potential that many supernatural beings had feared would emerge as her hybrid nature matured into conscious control over powers that could theoretically reshape reality, according to her desires and emotional responses to environmental stimuli that triggered defensive or aggressive reactions in beings whose survival had depended on overwhelming force rather than diplomatic solutions to territorial or resource conflicts. The supernatural courts recognized hybrid rights through new legislation that established legal frameworks for beings whose existence transcended traditional species categories, creating precedents for chosen transformation that allowed individuals to modify their supernatural nature through bridge witch intervention rather than being permanently bound by circumstances of their initial conversion or magical inheritance that had previously determined species identity without regard for personal preference or life, circumstances that might make alternative supernatural expressions more appropriate for individual needs and goals. The protocols also addressed consent requirements for transformation that protected vulnerable individuals from coercion, while ensuring that supernatural enhancement remained available to humans who demonstrated understanding of implications and commitment to responsibilities that came with abilities that could affect entire communities through individual choices about power usage and social integration that required ongoing education and support systems designed around hybrid psychology rather than pure-blood supernatural development patterns. 1 year after Isabella's birth, the family unit that had emerged from impossible pregnancy functioned with harmony that surprised everyone who had predicted disaster from vampire-human romantic relationships that attempted to bridge fundamental differences in nature, lifespan, and social needs that had made such partnerships historically unsuccessful due to incompatible requirements for emotional satisfaction and physical survival that created inevitable conflicts between human mortality and vampire immortality. Arya reflected on the morning when 5 pregnancy tests had mocked her from bathroom counter, understanding now that those failed pills had been first indication that her life was about to transform in ways that extended far beyond personal relationship changes to encompass responsibility for supernatural community evolution that required bridging gaps between species that had maintained separation for centuries through careful avoidance of circumstances that might have led to integration or conflict that could have exposed magical existence to human populations, unprepared for revelation that challenged fundamental assumptions about reality and humanity's place in cosmic hierarchy, that included beings with capabilities that transcended normal limitations of biology and physics. Isabella's first word came during mediation session between arguing supernatural representatives whose territorial dispute had escalated beyond diplomatic resolution through traditional court intervention, her clear pronunciation of choice somehow carrying enough authority to make ancient beings pause their conflict and consider alternatives to violence that had seemed inevitable until infant voice introduced concept of voluntary cooperation rather than impose dominance through superior strength or magical advantage that typically determined outcomes of supernatural political disagreements. The word carried implications that resonated through supernatural consciousness like ripples spreading across still water, suggesting that Isabella's ultimate nature would involve facilitating voluntary rather than forced resolution of conflicts that had plagued supernatural communities for millennia, through inability to find common ground between competing interests and fundamentally different approaches to survival and social organization that had made peaceful coexistence possible only through careful avoidance of meaningful interaction. Other women began appearing at Arya's door carrying positive pregnancy tests and impossible stories about supernatural encounters that had resulted in hybrid pregnancies requiring guidance through transformation choices that would determine not only their personal futures, but the development of supernatural human integration that could reshape civilization if managed carefully through education and support systems that honored individual autonomy while protecting community interests that required stable social structures capable of adapting to increasing presence of beings whose nature transcended traditional categories of human or supernatural identity and capability.